So, good afternoon everyone, and like the previous speakers, very happy to be here to add a different perspective to homes drawing upon work around platform-mediated peer-to-peer exchange that I've been working on for quite a long while. And so the first question on the slide then, can a home be shared, is in many ways an obvious one to answer. Of course, they can be shared and they are being shared, but when it comes to platform-mediated sharing, then I guess the more interesting questions to be asked are perhaps how they are being shared, by whom, and at what cost, and who's going to be bearing the cost. So those are some of the things I'll focus on a little bit here. And just to kind of give you a framing of what we're talking about, network hospitality is a concept from Jenny Drummond-Maltz to frame this phenomenon of using technological platforms to share homes, not with our friends and our relatives as historically has always been done, but also with strangers, which is not completely unprecedented either, but something that for most people would feel like something a little bit novel and emergent. And mostly when this discussion is being had, the kind of primary take is to look at homes as physical places where one or multiple people live. And for the work that I'm going to be talking about here, important also to note that these are places where these people live as their primary residence, and that they then have opted to open up for short-term visitors via an online platform. So the work here draws upon interview-based research I led back in 2012 to 2014, so quite a long time ago, both in Finland and in the US, both on the east and west coast. And here we engaged with people who were hosting visitors via platforms, so two different platforms, Couchsurfing and Airbnb, and I'll just explain a little bit what those are, especially Couchsurfing might be less familiar to some of you in the room. So Couchsurfing is a platform for network hospitality that explicitly bans the people involved from using money to pay for the hospitality that is being received. But that of course doesn't mean that there wouldn't be some kind of reciprocation going on. So on the level of its ideals, the community relies on, first of all, it being a community, on an idea of generalized reciprocity, so the idea that someone might be hosting you now and then later on you're going to be hosting someone else. So rather than there being direct pairings, it's going to be kind of evening out on the level of the community over time. But beyond that, of course, there are other things going on as well. Expectations of a sociable time are often a key reason why people choose to host on Couchsurfing, accumulating a good reputation where people are hosting specifically with the expectation that then they later on will be able to benefit from others' hospitality. And then there are also forms of direct reciprocity coming into the picture. Little gifts and gestures of gratitude and appreciation are quite common in these relationships. And then Airbnb, the other example, which I imagine is going to be more familiar to more of you here, either from personal experience or from the lot of media attention the platform has been attracting for many years now. So Airbnb instead operates with clear price tags involved, so the guest is going to be paying for the hospitality and the platform is mediating those payments. So the guest and host don't need to be managing money face to face, but rather all of this gets taken care of in the background through the platform. But what we saw in our research with Airbnb hosts back in 2012 to 14, and looking at hosts who were these kind of small scale hosts who were hosting people in their own homes rather than the commercial actors that have been taking up more and more of the platform over the years, was that money still wasn't the only reason for them to get involved, and often it wasn't a sufficient reason. Like, it was important that they were gaining money from the hosting, but if they weren't also having a socially meaningful experience out of it, then they might just stop hosting. So social connections, pride in being able to be a good host, were some of the other reasons that got people involved in Airbnb hosting. And really then here we are looking at that small scale interpersonal connection, and I will get back to some of the structural issues in just a little bit, which are important to consider here when you think about homes more broadly. But if you first consider the role of technology a little bit in this, in thinking about what does it mean that technology is mediating home sharing. So what happens is that homes are represented online, and then these platforms enable guests and hosts to get into contact with one another and initially negotiate the terms of a stay. This looks really different depending on the platforms and also at what point in time are you looking at the platforms. On couchsurfing, typically there needs to be a lot more back and forth between the host and the guest. There's less kind of support in place from the platform side to facilitate host and guest finding each other and figuring out how to go about it, whereas Airbnb, especially over time, has become more and more of a booking flow that looks not much different from a hotel. And this has really important interactional consequences, because if you don't need to be doing that little back and forth, then by the time you meet in person at the actual physical home, you will have less of a relationship established coming in there. And there really are kind of big and important differences in how much platforms do to support the host and the guests, in terms of whether they offer some kind of assurances, in terms of managing payment or providing conflict resolution if there are issues that are coming up, and so forth. Airbnb typically assuming more of this couchsurfing being a lot less hands-on and kind of leaving it up to the people themselves to figure out how to go about. And I think interestingly we can also think about money as a technology here that plays a key role in that it can really make things more clear-cut and familiar to many people. So talking to people who were hosting both on couchsurfing and Airbnb, we could really see how the kind of sometimes the fact that there was a clear price tag then also took off some of the pressure of the interactions, whereas on couchsurfing, because this is something that people are offering without the direct payment, then the guest might be wondering what is it that the host is expecting to get out of this interaction, or how should they go about it. So sometimes money, in fact, can be a social lubricant kind of counterintuitively. Yeah. But then, no matter what the technology in the platform-mediated setup is doing, what happens in home sharing of this type is that what happens online and what gets started online doesn't stay online, but people actually need to arrive at the house, knock on a door, and enter. And this is where face-to-face interactions become really important, and also there is less that technology can do to control and kind of help people manage that part of the encounter, which is of course in many ways the actual encounter that matters. And so a lot of finer details of what gets shared and in what ways and at what times of the day, what's being made available for the guest is often the kind of thing that needs to be managed in person, and there's a lot of interactional work that both guest and host need to be doing to handle this. And this then brings us to the interactional work that's needed, regardless of the kind of, whether there's a price tag or not. There are things that need to happen in terms of people acting out the roles of the host and a guest, and managing the encounter and also the other relationships surrounding it. So while hospitality literature traditionally often focuses on this host-guest relationship and has often looked at this as a kind of dyadic setup, when we think about homes in particular as a place where hospitality is being offered, a kind of typical thing about homes is that they are often already shared, so there's more than one people living in them. And when it comes to platform-mediated sharing, it might be that there's somebody in the household who's very excited about hosting visitors, others may be less interested, maybe even a bit reluctant, but by the time guests are arriving, then everybody kind of has to get involved to an extent. And these kind of negotiations among household members becomes really key in making home sharing possible and also making it acceptable to those who are kind of very directly impacted by it. But then also importantly, of course, it's not only the people inside a household who get affected by these practices, but it might also have an influence on the neighbors in apartment buildings. If there's somebody who's steadily renting out or sharing their home, this will have an influence to what it feels like to live in that whole building, even if it's not in your unit that any stranger is staying at all. And as we've seen over the past years, it can also, of course, affect entire neighborhoods, impacting the feel of a particular neighborhood if all of a sudden there is a larger influx of tourists to an area that did not used to be touristic at all. This is something that will influence the homes of many more than just those who have chosen to be involved in home sharing. So there are broader impacts then to consider beyond the confines of the physical home here, and these have become more and more pronounced over the decade. since we initially did these interviews. And then the second set of issues that I think is also really important to address here briefly is to reflect on who can participate and how easily can different people participate in home sharing. It is something that many people find kind of desirable to be able to be involved in, but it is not equally easy for everyone. So first, something we saw a lot in our work was this tendency of the host to prefer to welcome guests who were in some ways similar to themselves. In sociology, this phenomenon is known as homophily, sort of birds of a feather flock together happening, and this in itself doesn't necessarily need to be a problem. It happens in societies all over in every case, but then when we think of this happening through platforms that are operating on quite broad scale, it does become problematic when it kind of stacks up the cards in a way where it then is perhaps better characterized as discrimination, where specific groups end up having a disproportionately hard time to take part in home sharing or to benefit from its kind of gains in equally good terms. So there's been research elsewhere showing how some groups of hosts may not be able to command equally high prices from their Airbnb hosting and so forth, which then kind of, obviously the more this starts looking like commerce, the more it's evident that this should not be acceptable. So lots of issues there, and just to conclude and wrap up a little bit, so yes, homes can be shared via platforms, even with strangers, and it's happening at scale, but we should be really attentive to who can participate and at what cost does the sharing happen and who bears the cost, not necessarily always the direct stakeholders who might actually stand to benefit from these things, while it might be the broader surroundings that are impacted in more kind of counterproductive ways. And of course, this brings us back to some of what Bridgette was mentioning already in her notes. So we're at home, not merely in the houses and apartments that we live in, but also in their surroundings and the relationships that surround them. So when we think about home sharing, I think it's really important to take this broader relational view to think about how opening up homes impacts then in a broad way, not just the people directly involved who choose to be involved, but also a much broader set of people around them. Thank you.